So the reading is from John chapter 14, verse 1 to 10. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way of the place where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am the Father, and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you are not just my own. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work.
This is the bit where I do my talk, which shouldn't be too long a talk, he says. When the preacher says, don't worry, it won't be a very long talk. Okay, now, I'm just going to move that a bit. Now, in the ancient world, there were obviously lots of ancient religions around the world. Ancient religions that the Israelites, as they lived their life, whether it was when they were in captivity in Egypt or whether it was when they were journeying through to their new home in the Promised Land, the Israelites encountered all these other religions of the world. And there was something about all of them, actually, that they shared, and that was that in all the ancient religions, they had various gods, often multiple gods for different things, but each of the gods would have a temple, and within the temple would be what they called an image of the god. And that was, for the ancient religions, that was literally, either made out of wood, a sort of figure of this god, or perhaps later on made out of stone. And then if the culture was quite a wealthy one, you might even have an image of the god made out of gold or something like that. And the idea was that when the people went to the temple of whatever god it was, this image of the god represented who that god was. It showed them what that god was like, who they were, and it's where the people would come to perhaps give what they needed to give to that god to make them happy. So the idea of gods and images of gods was a very, very familiar one in the ancient world. Those images represented the god, and they were the visible presence of that god in the world. Now, we have the next slide. The God of the Bible came along and kind of rewrote the book on this and told them that actually that was not how we should think of him. In fact, one of the things that the God of the Bible commanded the ancient Israelites was never make a graven or carved image of me. Don't do that. Don't make me out of gold or stone or wood and put me in a building and come and worship that. Because, and one of the reasons why this was, because actually God had already told them that he'd already made an image of himself in the world. So this is Genesis chapter 1. And it says, then God said, let us make humankind in our image. And that's that word, and in our likeness. And then it says, so God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So it's quite repetitive. God keeps using this word, an image of God, because they knew what an image of God was. But the revolutionary thing that God said through Israel was that actually it's not some lump of stone or gold or other metal, it's you. We, human beings, we're the ones God has put in the world, made in his image. And what that means is that we are supposed to be, in everything that God made in this universe, human beings are supposed to be the place, the people, where God is represented to the rest of the universe. We, human beings, were created to represent and show the rest of the universe what God is like. We are the visible presence of God on earth. Now, a little bit later in Genesis, I think we've got another slide now, a kind of extra dimension was added to this, because this is just a bit later in Genesis, and it says, and these are both in the same passage, Genesis 5:1-3, but look at the similarities. So first it says, when God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God, and he called them humankind, or humans. But then it says, when Adam had lived 130 years, so this one human, he had a son in his own likeness and in his own image, and he named him Seth. So do you see the similarities? What God did at the beginning when he created all humankind, it now says actually that's what happens when we have children. When Adam had a son, he was in his likeness and image, and he gave him a name. Now what that's saying is that one aspect of us saying we're made in God's image is that God is our Father and we're his children. And it's just like when somebody, say, I have a child, and some people say Isaac looks a little bit like me. Does he? Yeah. Sometimes parents have children that look uncannily like them. And that's kind of the idea here, that, when we human beings have a child, they bear a resemblance to us. Okay? And we know that. Adam's son, Seth, was like him. He looked like him a bit. But you see, that helps us understand what it means that we're in God's image and that we were created in God's likeness. We're supposed to look like our Father in heaven. We're supposed to resemble him in our life and in our living. Now, we're going to think a bit more about that, because that's quite challenging when you start thinking about it. And perhaps we're not doing terribly well at that all the time. But I thought we'd just do an activity now. You should have had on your table a list of fathers and sons of famous people. So I think the next slide, did any of you do this? So the point of this is some people do, the father does look like their child. So whose father is this? Anyone? Boris Johnson's father. Boris Johnson. Right? Correct. So they look very similar, don't they? Right, the next one. So whose father did you think that was? I'll give you a clue. He's an actor. Yeah? Stallone? It's not Stallone. It's not Sylvester Stallone. It is an actor. He's one of my favourite actors, actually. No, it's not. Not Robert De Niro. It is. There you go. Yeah. All right, next one. Now, this one's for the children. So, Isaac and Sophia. Whose daddy is that? Whose daddy is that? Yeah. Yeah, whose daddy is it? That's a bit confusing when he's called Daddy Pig. What's the name of his children? Peppa Pig and Peppa and George. And look how similar they look. Don't they look like their dad? They really look like their dad. Okay, I think there's one more. Right, whose father is that? Do you want a clue? No. It's a very famous singer. What do you think, Adrienne? No, it's not Piers Morgan. I can see he does look a bit like Piers Morgan. He actually does look like Piers Morgan, doesn't he? No. And a much more famous singer than that. I'll give you a clue. Oh. It's Elvis's dad. I thought they looked... Right. Okay, and now we're going to look at some famous sons. So on these ones, the picture is of the son, and you've got to guess who the dad is. Well done. That's Tom Hanks' son. Don't they look very similar? Okay, now it's the children. Who do you think this one's daddy is? Do you know who that is? It is, yes, that's Postman Pat's son. Look at that. Aren't they similar? They even both play guitar. Next one. Right, whose son is that? No. Vince got it right. It's Bob Marley's son, and his name is Ziggy Marley, apparently. We just got two more, haven't we? Do you know whose son that is? A famous actor? No. Yes, Clint Eastwood's son, and his name's Scott Eastwood. Right, well done, well done. You did well. Okay, so the point of that was to show really that's kind of the idea the Bible has when it says Adam's son Seth was in his image and likeness. You know, there was a similarity between the fathers and the children, and there is in our lives. But that, as I said, helps us understand what God means when he says, I've created you in my image. We are supposed to resemble God. We were talking about this on Tuesday, and Mike said we're supposed to be a chip off the old block. We're supposed to look and behave like God. Now, that's probably making us all wince a bit and think, we're not doing a very good job of that all the time, are we? Sometimes we do. You know, if Genesis 1 is anything to go by, what does God do? Well, he creates a world and he brings lots of blessings. He brings goodness, he brings life, he brings abundance, and all those sorts of things. If we're supposed to be doing that for the world, if we're supposed to be bringing life and goodness and blessing to the world, sometimes we do that. Sometimes we do that, and I'm going to get you to think about how we do that in a minute. But a lot of the time we don't. And at the end of the day, we realize we've pretty much messed it up a lot of the time. And that's why one of the reasons God sent Jesus. So when Jesus came to the world, the Bible then starts talking about image again, the same word. So Colossians 1 says, Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So when Paul writes that, he's obviously going back to Genesis in his mind. He talks about the first person over in all creation, and he talks about the image of God, but he says this time it's Jesus where you see that. There is now a person, Jesus, who became human, who is indeed the perfect image of God. And when he says Jesus is the firstborn over all creation, we said, well, surely that's already happened. But he says, no, it's all starting over again. It's like a new creation now. Jesus has come, the image of God within a human being. And Paul said, it's like it's all started again, a whole new creation. Jesus is the first of a new creation. 2 Corinthians 4 also says, the light of the good news of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So when we think about how we've perhaps not always lived up to our calling to be people created in God's image, well, the New Testament says that's one of the reasons Jesus came to the world, so that he can kind of begin again what we're meant to be. I can't remember what the next slide is, by the way. Right. So, we're thinking about God as Father and us as his children. In John 14, David read this for us earlier. Philip asked a question to Jesus. He said, Lord, show us the Father. Really interesting question. We want to see what God the Father's like, Philip says. We want to see him, we want to know him, to see exactly who he is. Jesus replied, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. The words, he gives an example. He says, the words I say to you, they're not just my own. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. So if we want to see exactly what the Father looks like, we look at Jesus. Jesus exactly, perfectly, entirely represents and shows us who God the Father is, so that when you see Jesus, you see the Father. And he says what he's doing, therefore, in the world, what Jesus was here doing, the kinds of things we read about in the Gospels, going around, healing, helping, challenging sometimes, but giving people new life, ultimately dying for us on the cross and rising again. That is actually the Father living in Christ, doing his work for us. And then it says this, And Jesus says, and so we can't just leave it at that and say, oh, that's great theology. Jesus then says, look, I tell you the truth. Anyone who has faith in me will do what I've been doing. So Jesus says, I'm here. I'm showing you the Father. Everything I'm doing is what the Father is doing in me. And then he starts talking about us doing it as well. Anyone who believes in me is going to be doing just what I have been doing. That's what we were created to be. Image of God. People reflecting, showing the creation who our God is. And it's actually, in the end of the day, it's by coming to Jesus that we can actually begin to do that as we should be. I think I've got one final verse. Yeah, this is an incredible verse in Romans 8. For God always knew and had decided that we would be formed into, it sort of means, formed into the image of his Son, so that Jesus might be the firstborn of many brothers and sisters. So this is Paul again. What did God always want to do from the beginning of the world? He wanted us to be formed into the image of Christ, so that Christ is the firstborn, but he would be the firstborn of many people, us. We can begin to live for God as we should do, and we do that by coming to Jesus. Because when we do, he changes us, he makes us new, we're a new creation, and his Spirit is given to help us day by day to live more and more as we should. I think there is one more just to finish with. This is just to leave with you. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. You did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear. You received the spirit of adoption. So that's talking about the fact that you know who you are now. God's not made you a slave. God's not made it so that you're afraid of what's happening. He says he's given you his own spirit, which is the spirit of adoption. You're his. And by that spirit we cry. What do we cry? Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we're heirs, heirs of God, and co-heirs with Christ. You know, Jesus is like the King of Kings, and yet he's quite happy to say, yeah, we're co-heirs with him of everything that God has planned. For if we share in Christ's suffering, we will also share in his glory.